Okay po. Okay, let's start po. All right, good afternoon. Can you please go to the program po? Welcome to the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea Forum with the theme Philippines amidst the rising tension between US and China in the West Philippine Sea. So let's all put our right hand over our chest for our Philippine national anthem.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas. Kayang mag-ibig, kaya sa sinanghanan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang binirang, kuya ka ng mag-ibig, sa mandulupin, di ka masisigil, sa nagtatagputok sa simoy at sa langit o pagaw. Hinatang tula, kawin sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na nag-iinig. Ang bituin na taraw niya kailan ang hindi matitigig. Luman ang araw ng walhaging pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya ng pagkay mga amin, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
And now, we would like to present to you our most Reverend Monsignor Jerry Bitoon, who's a rector of the Cathedral Parish of St. Paul the Hermit, San Pablo City, Laguna, Philippines, to do our invocation. Reverend Monsignor Jerry Bitoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. In Psalm number 17, verses 8 to 10, we hear these comforting words and very assuring. Lord, keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings from the wicked who are out to destroy me. From my mortal enemies who surround me, they close up their callous hearts and their mouths speak with arrogance. Father God, creator of heaven and earth, under your sovereign lordship, you have provided for each nation what rightfully belongs to its people so that they can live with dignity, honor, and abundance of life. We come to you humbly asking for protection from abusive forces that threatens to endanger the territorial integrity and sovereignty of our country. We thank you, Father, for giving birth 5 years ago to a movement that works to instill values of patriotism among the Filipino youth, the hope of our land, to assert with courage and bravery of our heroes what truly belong to our nation. Guide with your spirit of truth this virtual forum as we observe the 5th foundation anniversary of the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea. Grant that we be steadfast and untiring in resisting deception and lies so that we can uphold and defend what is true and right, convinced that the truth will set us free. Bless our resource persons and everyone who will play key role in this virtual forum, instilling in them the right thoughts in their mind, right words in their lips, and right spirit in their hearts, so that you be always glorified and honored. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much, Reverend Monsignor Jerry Bitoon, for that very inspirational invocation. And now let us go to the opening remarks. So since I am also the MC, so I will introduce myself. I don't need to introduce myself. Anyway, it's right there. As the global chairperson and founder of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea and the organizer of West Philippine Sea Forum, I'm Dr. Celia B. Lampkin. Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. 5 years ago, or about a year before the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, Netherlands, issued its decision on the arbitration case between the Philippines and China. A group of Filipinos, fueled by their burning patriotism, amidst the growing tension that the arbitration case would bring, decided to come together and form what is now called the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea. We rejoice with the Filipino people in general and with the residents of Pag-asa Islands in Kalayaan Group of Islands or the Spratly Islands in Palawan, the fisher folks of Scarborough Shoal and their families within the proximity of the West Philippine Sea when the tribunal decided in favor of the Philippines and pinned our hopes that with the decision, we have cemented our territorial rights to our advocacy. Our happiness was short-lived because the months that followed after the decision saw how the tides have turned and the stance of the newly installed Philippine government seemed to have changed its tune. The succeeding pronouncements, coupled by various developments and incidents in the West Philippine Sea, have Filipinos abuzz in social media with differing opinions on how we should view and assert our sovereign rights in the areas after the UN arbitral tribunal decision. Filipinos, sadly, have become and are still continuously polarized when it comes to how we should assert our sovereignty. The National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea has long recognized that the main reason why we are polarized when it comes to our sovereign rights is the lack of a true understanding of the truth behind the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration decision and the principles behind it. This, and the more vicious reason, the propaganda that our government and its apologists have fed the less discerning Filipinos. After 4 years of the tribunal decision, many of our fellow Filipinos' polarized views are due to their refusal to understand the decision, primarily due to their affiliation and support of the political personalities who are caught in the web of the sovereignty issues. 5 years and those years have been a sink and swim for the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea in maintaining the fervor that we had when we first decided to become one voice in advancing our advocacy. The wins, quote unquote, may have been few, but we continue to press on because we are relentless in this advocacy. 5 years, and we continue to believe that getting involved in preserving our sovereignty is a basic responsibility of everyone and Juana, of every patriotic Filipino. We believe and will continue to believe that being effectively and adequately informed is key to awakening everyone and Juana's patriotism. We as a nation cannot cease to care about preserving the territories which are rightfully ours, especially that is backed by a rules-based decision of the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration. We stand but our patriotism to uphold the Constitution, because only by doing so can we move forward as a free nation. I warmly welcome everyone, of course, our guest speaker from Hawaii, Captain Schuster, and all the guests, and all the netizens, the global audience, and wish that we will have another productive interaction in today's session. Thank you very much. I would like to give a brief bio of Attorney Lloyd and Nicholas Lewis, a good friend of mine. Attorney Lloyd and Nicholas Lewis is the national chairperson of the U.S. Pinoys for Good Governance. And also, she is the global chairperson of the Global Filipino Diaspora Council. Attorney Lewis is an immigration lawyer. She is also a businesswoman, a CEO of a billion-dollar empire that she ran when her beloved husband, Reginald F. Lewis, passed away. The autobiography of her late husband, Mr. Lewis' book, Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun, will be launched this month on Amazon Audible. The reason why I am sharing this one, because it is something that's very inspirational. It is not an advertisement, but it's something that I would like to share to you, that once you read, and now it's not only a print, but it's also something audible, it will inspire everyone, the youth and everyone. Attorney Lewis is also an author of an immigration book, How to Get a Green Card. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a pleasure to welcome Attorney Lloyda Nicholas Lewis for her welcoming remarks.
Congratulations to the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea on your 5th anniversary. And I commend and I admire Dr. Celia Lampkin for her fortitude and her courage in founding this youth movement, because in the end, it's the young people of the Philippines who will inherit the consequences of what is happening in the West Philippine Sea now. 4 years ago, the United Nations International Tribunal ruled against China in favor of the Philippines, affirming that the 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone belongs to the Philippines and not to China. Because what has been found within this exclusive economic zone? Million barrels of fossil oil and trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And who want to exploit and to use and to own these natural resources of the Philippines? Our big brother and bully, China, who has started to create military islands around the EEZ and has prevented our fishermen from fishing in their natural fishing grounds since then. Therefore, when President Duterte stated during a Filipino-Chinese Friendship Association in the Philippines, that when he said, quote, "The Philippines is now a province of China," unquote, we Filipinos in the United States were shocked and incredulous, because the Philippine president saying that is an act of treason and the ultimate cowardice. And so, to you, Dr. Celia Lamkin, and the members of the National Movement for the West Philippine Sea, you truly are the hope of the motherland, Pilipinas. Go on and keep going. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Now this is the most awaiting person for our forum. Is Captain Carl Otis Schuster of Hawaii. Okay, I would like to give a brief biography of our guest speaker for this forum. And first of all, of course, I would like to thank him for accepting my invitation to become our guest speaker for today's forum. Okay, Captain Carl Otis Schuster is a retired U.S. Navy. He was commissioned as an ensign at the University of South Carolina Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps Battalion on May 10, 1974. Captain Carl Schuster reported to the destroyer USS Glennon apostrophe DD-840 as its Combat Information Center Officer, CICO, the following week. While assigned to the Glennon, he also served temporary attachments to other services units as a Navy liaison for special operations and as an observer aboard the ballistic missile submarine USS Simon Bolivar SS-8 and -641 as part of an operations security review and contingency deployment. He spent his first 10 years of naval service as a surface line officer when his language skills led to his serving on several Allied naval ships and being loaned out to national agencies. Lieutenant Commander Schuster transferred to Naval Intelligence in 1984, serving first as the chief of General Rogers' U.S. Intelligence Cell at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers, Europe, during the Intermediate Nuclear Force, or the INF, Multinational Force in Lebanon, MNF, and follow-on force attack initiatives and crisis in Europe from that tour. He was transferred to Commander Task Force 60 Staff, Operational Commander of U.S. Naval Forces in the Mediterranean, and he spent the remainder of his career in various top positions, often serving as the public face of intelligence in Europe, Hawaii, and Japan. He retired from the Navy as a captain on June 1st, 1999. After retirement, he directed the U.S. Pacific Command's Virtual Information Center that pioneered the operational use of open source of intelligence, or the OSINT, from 1999 to 2003. Cubic Applications Corporate think tank in Hawaii from 2003 to 2018. He has been teaching as an adjunct faculty at Hawaii Pacific University's Diplomacy and Military Program since January 2020. He is also a part-time defense consultant. Additionally, He has published over 700 articles in magazines, newspapers, and academic publications over the last 40 years. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure to present to you our guest speaker for today's forum, Captain Carl Otis Schuster. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. The honor is mine. I'd like to thank Dr. Celia Lampkin for inviting me to speak and for that very kind introduction, and to all of you for being willing to listen. The rising tensions in the West Philippine Sea, or as it's more commonly known in America, the South China Sea, are a concern to all of us, with implications for the nations bordering that globally important waterway and far beyond. The tensions have been rising rapidly over the last 2 years, more so than in any period of the last 40 years. Most of that is due to the belated US and international reaction to China's long-standing aggression and military activities there over the last 20 years. China's bullying cannot be denied. Its campaign, however, has been patient, its aggression undertaken in a series of small steps. And each time, the international community thought this is the last step. We can work with them. And that has never been true. The Scarborough Shoal incident of April 2012 awakened American policymakers, but for a variety of reasons, they limited their response because President Xi promised to halt military construction and take no further military actions. However, as the Philippines and Vietnam can attest, China's bullying, destructive fishing, and construction practices have continued. America's new administration saw an increasingly powerful China establishing a very threatening pattern of behavior and decided to act. The response has been expanding America's freedom of navigation operations in the Western Pacific, and not just in the West Philippine Sea. Beijing has also threatened Japan and its fishermen in the East China Sea. As shown on this slide, America has tripled the number of aerial freedom of navigation ops, or FONOPs as we call them, and is on track to double the number of ship passages over that done last year. Other countries have largely joined suit, expanding their operations in the South China Sea as well, Australia and Japan, for example. And India is about to do so. China has, of course, responded in its own way, expanding its naval patrolling, issuing more threatening rhetoric, and since 2018, more naval exercises, and they're also of a larger scale, as we see on the next slide. That enlarged effort and the escalating rhetoric that followed is the task, or basis, I should say, of today's heightened tensions. The good news is that the two countries have not conducted their exercises in the same area at the same time. So there's very little to no risk of a conflict erupting from miscalculation. As you see here, the South China Sea has experienced almost monthly naval exercises so far this year, despite the COVID-19 pandemic. Both nations are demonstrating the pandemic has not crippled their respective naval capabilities. However, two of the developments of the last year have long-term implications. The latest Chinese exercises have included all three Air Command's fleets operating in 4 separate regional areas. More importantly, last month saw the Strategic Rocket Force's first publicly visible participation in a live-fire naval exercise. We don't know the nature of the target, but launching those 4 missiles from 2 separate locations over 1,000 miles away demonstrates, or I should say, requires a level of planning, coordination, and command and control that was considered beyond China's capability just 10 years ago. That is a significant step in China's transition to joint military operations, and it significantly increases their military capabilities. More tactically, China has deployed aerial surveillance, fighter, and missile-capable bomber aircraft to its West Philippine Sea territories as part of those exercises. The bombers and fighters primarily have staged to the Paracel Islands and not into the Spratlys. but China's bases in the Spratlys are capable of supporting those aircraft's presence there. It is clear China is preparing to station forces capable of monitoring and controlling the South China Sea's air and sea space. The next slide depicts that concern, and you see it right there for you with the two maps. On the left, you see China's 9-dash line claims that encompass over 90% of the South China Sea, an indefensible claim that goes back only 74 years. The map on the right shows China's territorial seizures in the West Philippine Sea over the last 46 years. All but the most recent of those invasions or assaults have failed to draw international criticisms or objections from the international community. Now, the next slide shows America's position on the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea claims. Most of the claimants are friendly nations, indeed partner countries. We consider the West Philippine Sea to be international waters and a critical regional waterway that handles between $3.4 to $5 trillion worth of mercantile volume annually. As such, America opposes any effort to restrict or control the freedom to transit those waters. Freedom of the seas is America's longest continuous foreign policy principle. It dates back to the very founding of our nation. Add to that the fact that the Philippines is America's longest standing ally in Southeast Asia, and you can see America's commitment. The 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty, which remains in force, calls for the United States to come to Manila's aid if the Philippines comes under attack. Unfortunately, prior to 2012, American officials did not feel that extended to Manila's South China Sea territories, because in their eyes, doing so constituted taking a side in the territorial disputes. Now, the next slide will show you how China has exploited that. China conquered Paracel Islands from South Vietnam in January 1974, and South Johnson Reef and 5 other reefs and atolls from Vietnam in 1988. Since then, China's People's Armed Maritime Militia and Coast Guard have rammed and sunk Vietnamese fishing boats throughout the West Philippine Sea, leaving the crews to fend for themselves. China's Coast Guard has also conducted regular intimidation operations against Vietnam's Coast Guard patrol craft around the Paracels and other parts of the West Philippine Sea. China has also built hardened and heavily armed fishing shelters across the Spratlys, starting in the late 1980s, and began covertly removing other countries' boundary markers in that same period. The escalation was slow, but very evident, and both Vietnam and the Philippines tried to get international attention to be focused on it. Beijing, however, exploited international attention looking elsewhere. For example, they took advantage of a weather-driven absence of Philippine patrolling to seize Mischief Reef in 1995. The Philippines protested. The United States issued a weak disappointment at China's action, but reminded Philippine officials of the Mutual Defense Treaty's limits, essentially acquiescing to China's aggression, albeit unofficially. The Philippines had no choice but to garrison the Second Thomas Shoal by running aground the LST Sierra Madre so it could support a small marine garrison of a handful of troops. China predictably blockades the shoal in hopes of forcing Manila to withdraw the Marines. Now here we are, 15 years later, and of course the Philippines has the political will to hold. President Xi, when gently pressed over China's large-scale construction program during the early parts of this century, President Xi promised then President Obama that China would halt expansion of its military facilities in the South China Sea and initiate no new construction. But as we see on this next slide, China continued the construction, so President Obama announced an Asia pivot to reassure America's Asian partners and allies. He formally recognized that the Mutual Defense Treaty included any attacks on Philippine forces in the West Philippine Sea. The 2016 Court of Arbitration ruling has legitimized that commitment as those territories are now internationally recognized as belonging to the Philippines. However, the rebalance did not involve new forces coming to the Pacific, but rather it reflected the reduction of air and naval forces in the Atlantic that suddenly made the Pacific forces larger by comparison. President Obama did increase freedom of navigation operations in the West Philippine Sea, but had the ships announced they were conducting innocent passage. Under international law, innocent passage is declared only when transiting through recognized territorial waters. Innocent passage precludes any flight operations or weapons training and limits maneuvering to that required to maintain safe navigation. So, in effect, that restricted announcement provided a confusing picture. Were we conducting freedom of navigation operations, or were we accepting China's claims of territorial waters? Because warships in international waters need make no such declaration and can maneuver and operate freely. So here we are. Despite President Xi's 2016 promise, its military construction has continued, and in many cases even accelerated. Its radars and other sensors can monitor much, if not most, of the West Philippine Sea's airspace and waters. Its 4 largest facilities in the South China Sea can accommodate aircraft, surface-to-air, and both land attack and anti-ship cruise missiles. They're not stationed there yet, but they do periodically stage there. That raises questions about China's intentions. Anonymous Chinese officials have reported China plans to declare a West Philippine Sea, or in their words, South China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone. Given China's garrisons already present and Beijing's policy that all flights through any of its ADIZ, as they're called, must be coordinated in advance, prudent analysts can be forgiven for suspecting the PRC intends to control use of that airspace at a minimum during a crisis, if not at all times. So what does that mean for the Philippines? There are 2 developments Manila cannot control, if you see in the next slide. The direction of the Sino-American strategic competition may take, for example. Philippines can influence that, but not control it, and China's increasing tendency to ignore international law. It can influence those developments through its actions and policies, but again, it cannot control them. However, it does offer opportunities and risk, both over the short and long term. Militarily, investing in protecting your island territories adds deterrent value, and diplomatically, expanding your potential partners increases China's risk should they attempt to create an incident. Although not listed here on this slide, there is an opportunity to reach out to India, who shares regional concerns about China's behavior and has an expanding economy that may offer potential trade opportunities. So, Philippines can develop regional and beyond regional partners. Start building those partnerships today because they may serve well over the long term. Remember, China plays the long game. Its internal problems may force it to shift inward, but no one can afford to bank their future on that. So take a long view. The good news is that Manila's resorting to the International Court of Arbitration earned it not only great respect in the United States, but it may also offer opportunities for partnerships with other claimants. One cannot understate the international respect the Philippines gained not only by taking it to the International Court of Arbitration, but by its victory. There are other things too to consider. The Philippines' widespread use of English and its computer software expertise may provide a welcoming environment for US and other information technology companies seeking to reduce their China presence and investment. And the impact of that cannot be understated. Asia is the future, and the Philippines enjoys goodwill across the continent and probably in Africa and Latin America as well. Unfortunately, there are no easy solutions. Aggressors are bold in the face of weakness. Deterring a powerful aggressor is always a difficult challenge, one that no nation should attempt alone. So building a stronger Philippines creates a nation that can lead and deter. And barring any questions, I thank you again for having me speak, and that concludes my formal comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Captain Carl Schuster, for a very enlightening, informative, and factual information about what's happening in the South China Sea since way back 40 years up to the present. So now we will be proceeding now with the open forum. And before we proceed to that, I would like to introduce the panelists for this forum. The first panelist is Dr. Giao Huang. I would like to read his short bio. Dr. Giao Huang has more than 30 years in legal education and research. He was working as a full-time professor of law at Law Faculty of Vietnam National University in Hanoi, Vietnam from 1997 to 2009. He was also teaching public international law. Currently, he's still working as a senior visiting lecturer for master's and PhD students of the Law Faculty of the Vietnam National University. At Law Faculty, Da Nang Economics University, from 2009 to 2019, he taught courses of international public and private laws, international law of commerce, corporate law. Dr. Giao is the director of the Research Institute on Policy, Law, and Development, or the PLD Vietnam, since 2005. At PLD, Dr. Giao has successfully developed a clinical legal educational, or PLD CLE program, which is a networking of university students and legal instructors from different law faculties. Since 2009, Dr. Giao has established a law firm named as Huang Giao Law and Partners, HG Law Partners. He's a practicing laws and he's engaged in cases related to business sectors such as banks, real estate developers, trading companies, foreign investors in Vietnam, and insurance companies. Since 2013, Dr. Giao has become arbitrator of the International Arbitration Center of Vietnam at the Vietnam Chamber for Commerce and Industry. Dr. Giao has an extensive academic background and he received his PhD degree in 1988 at the Institute of State and Law, Academy of Sciences, or the former Soviet Union. Dr. Giao was granted a Fulbright Scholarship by the U.S. State Department as visiting scholar at Boston University Law School in 2003 to 2004. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Giao has been involved in legal policy projects and consultancy works in Vietnam, much of them with a focus on access of injustice, good governance, legal reform, anti-corruption. Many of these projects were under contracts by the World Bank, UNDP, ADB, Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Denmark, the Netherlands, and the U.S. Embassy. Dr. Giao has been actively on various international and domestic medias about legal issues, matters related to Vietnam, East-South, East Sea or South China Sea, and also he's well regarded within the Vietnamese law research and education community as a reliable, competent, and dedicated independent researcher. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you and present to you Dr. Giao Huang of Hanoi, Vietnam.
Well done.
Can we see his, I'm sorry, I don't see him. Sir Pablo, is there a screen that we can see him? It's okay, later, we will see him. All right, the next panelist is also from Vietnam. Attorney Viet Huang. Attorney Viet Huang is a lecturer of the Faculty of Law of the Ho Chi Minh University of Law in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He is an expert on international law and also the law of the sea. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to present to you Attorney Viet Huang. There is Attorney Viet Huang, yes.
Thank you very much
Okay.
for thank you, Dr. Lamkin,
All
for
right.
introduction. Yes.
Yes, you're welcome. All right. And our next panelist will be coming from the Philippines. The first one would be Captain Caruso Tagal. Captain Caruso Tagal hails from Cagayan Valley and graduated with a degree in Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering at Adamson University, Manila, Philippines. He was an illustrious member of the Philippine Air Force Flying School, Class 79A. Captain Tagal had been flying over Pag-asa Island and the rest of Calayan Islands, or the Spratly Islands, patrolling all the islands for the Philippines' national security when he was still a military pilot at the Philippine Air Force who was stationed in Palawan during that period. He is now a retired airline pilot. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and honor to present to you Captain Toti Tagal, or Caruso Tagal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lamkin.
You're welcome, Captain Tagal. Go ahead.
It's a pleasure to be a panelist.
All right, thank you so much. All right. And now our next panelist is Captain Edgar Alcantara. Captain Edgar Alcantara hails from Bukidnon, Mindanao, and he graduated with a degree of Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering at Fiat University, Manila, Philippines. He was an illustrious member of the Philippine Air Force Flying School Class 79. That's why he was a classmate of Captain Caruso Toti Tagal, or, on that class. Captain Alcantara, as a former Philippine Air Force pilot for 10 years, had been flying the transport aircraft to Pag-asa Island and the rest of the Calayan Islands, or the Spratly Islands, for his numerous resupply missions and bringing provisions to our troops in those islands, to troop para-dropping, since there was no airstrip to land on except the Pag-asa Island, where we have the Run Kudo Street. Captain Alcantara is now a retired airline pilot. Ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure and an honor to present to you Captain Edgar Alcantara. I can see, all right. So our next panelist, the last but not the least, is Captain Edgar Diamante. Diamante, like diamond in English. That's a last name, very nice last name. Captain Diamante graduated with a degree in Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering at Western Institute of Technology at Iloilo City, Philippines. Again, he was an illustrious member of Class 79 of the Philippine Air Force Flying School. Of course, so he was a classmate of Captain Tagal and Captain Alcantara. As a member of the Regular Officer Corps, Armed Forces of the Philippines, Captain Diamante has held various positions, namely instructor pilot for the 6 years at the Philippine Air Force Flying School, 100 Training Wing Fernando Air Base at Lipa City, Batangas, as a psychological operations warfare officer, Civil Relations Service of the Armed Forces of the Philippines in Camp Aguinaldo, Quezon City, and as a helicopter pilot on the 205th Helicopter Wing of the Philippine Air Force at the Villamor Air Base, Pasay City, Philippines. After his stint with the armed forces, Captain Diamante joined the Philippine Airlines, flying both domestic and international routes. He also has flown with Sri Lankan Airlines for 16 years as an expatriate pilot. With his experience in the military service and in the airline transport operations, he was able to impart his knowledge and skills to the next generation of pilots, both in the military and in the airline. Captain Diamante is now a retired airline pilot. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and pleasure to present to you our panelist, Captain Diamante.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon, Captain Diamante. You're welcome. So now, since we have presented our panelists, we would like to have some kind of house rules. We will entertain questions from the panelists, from the audience, from the guests, and those who are watching us, if they have sent their questions beforehand. And our guest speaker, Captain Schuster, is willing to answer those questions. And our panelists, they are free to react, to give comments, their opinions, and comments and opinions about the questions and also the answer. The panelists can also ask their co-panelists. So let's start now with the open forum. So who would like to start the... Who has a question right now? Please raise your hand physically. I can see right now, I'm sorry, on my end, I can only see Captain Edgar Diamante. I don't have a gallery on my end. So who would like to start the question to our guest speaker from the panelists? I would like to remind also, I'm sorry, Captain Diamante, just for a while. I would like to remind, I know we have guests, we have media guests from, I think from ABS-CBN and other print media. Please feel free to ask questions also. For now, I think Captain Edgar Diamante has a question. And also for the answer of the question, the panelists are only given a 1 minute slot for the answer. All right, Captain Edward Diamante.
Yeah, good afternoon. We have known some facts about the West Philippine Sea, and we know for the fact that the Philippines won the arbitral ruling against China, but China did not recognize the arbitral ruling, and the ruling cannot be enforced by the United Nations. China occupies the island in the West Philippine Sea and the sky, and the Philippine military is so weak it cannot drive out China from the islands. So my question is, what do we do now because of the situation?
All right, so go ahead, Captain Schuster. Yeah.
Well, I think your options are limited at the moment. The only thing that you can do is here's the balancing act that the Philippines faces. You need trade with China to grow your economy. You need to grow your economy to have more money to build a stronger military. And so you've got to find ways to pressure China and express your disgust, if you will, and opposition with what you've got. And what I would do if I had the authority, but it was easy for me to say, I'm an American thousands of miles away, I would keep supplying your forces on the islands that you still hold. I would maintain a presence in and around and constantly monitor the islands of yours that they occupy. And I would never let the UN or any other international forum forget that you have not accepted that reality. The other thing I would do is I would encourage companies that are currently investing in China to instead invest in the Philippines, and that those who are already in China, why not ship their investment to the Philippines? Philippines has a large educated population, very hardworking population, and they are very linguistically talented. When you think of information technology, the common language is English, and most of the programming is done in English, not all. But the Philippines is ideally located, if you will, to be a hub for that type of investment and many others besides. And so I would look at a whole of government approach. Maintain the monitoring, maintain the surveillance, let them know you haven't forgotten, look for ways to add the cost that China has to pay for what it's doing. Never let the international forums forget it, but also hit them in the pocketbook. I truly believe that the Philippines is well positioned to get expanded foreign investment, particularly now that China has demonstrated it doesn't respect rule of law. And if you're investing money, would you invest in a country that does not respect rule of law?
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain Schuster and Captain Jumente. That was really a very practical and realistic solutions, and it gave us more enlightenment and maybe for a future planning of what you have said. Thank you so much for that. So now, who would like to ask another question from the panelists?
Captain Tagal.
Okay, Captain Tagal, yes, please.
Good afternoon, I'm Captain Tagal. Just as a backgrounder, when we were flying in the 80s, in those island chains, China wasn't even a player. Our adversary during that time were the Vietnamese. And then when the US bases were removed from the country, that's when the Chinese began their aggression in claiming the islands. So, and as of now, they have moved and they have created a new ADIZ, which is very close to the Philippines. And I know ADIZ is being created by the country who is a power. Japan ADIZ was made by the United States US Air Force. Korean ADIZ was made by America. So the powers that be, they create the ADIZ. And without any dissenting opinion from the other countries, that ADIZ will remain. Now, on the side of the Philippines, we cannot do anything on the ADIZ, the new ADIZ that China made. So we just follow what they want in the commercial airline. We just file our clearance that will be passing those ADs. That's why nothing happens to our aircraft. Likewise, other aircraft, they file their clearance, they pass the new Chinese ADs. So nothing untoward happened to their airline. Unlike what happened during the Cold War, where the Korean airline entered the Russian ADs and it was shut down. So I don't have any question. I just want to impart that knowledge.
All right.
To our guests and everything and everybody.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much for that information and your experience when you were still a military pilot, Captain Toti Tagal. Captain Schuster, since Captain Tagal mentioned about the air defense identification zone, in the relation to that, I would like to ask this question. What is the possibility or what is the status now of China about this air defense identification zone in the West Philippine Sea, or of course for Vietnam, the East Sea, or Indonesia, the Natanet Sea? So, Captain Schuster.
Yes, ma'am. We don't know when China is going to do it. They've been talking about it now for 3 years. if I can, one of the maps I provided as a backup shows the border delineation of that ADIZ. And the Chinese haven't stated a date. It's my belief that they're waiting for an opportunity. I don't think they're going to do it before the US presidential election because it would be such a major provocation it would influence the election. And it would influence in a way they don't want it to be influenced. However, I do think once that election is finished, the odds of China instilling or installing that kind of ADIZ will increase as time advances. I'm not exactly sure why they're hesitating or why they may hesitate next year, but I do think it's coming, and they're going to do it in a very calculated fashion. And so the only thing I can tell you is that we just got a good reminder. The Soviet Union shot down 2 Korean airliners at opposite ends of the world for crossing into their ADIZ. China's a little smarter than the Soviet Union, but the threat is there. And if they're able to take control of the airspace, then they have a significant strategic advantage over those waters. And they're doing 2 things that worry me. One is the head of the International Civil Aviation Organization is now a Chinese official, a former member of their Central Committee. The other thing is the current Chinese ambassador to Hungary just got appointed to the International Court of Arbitration under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So China is looking at it and they're applying the lessons learned from their past mistakes. The next court will have, even if the Chinese judge is required to recuse himself, he will know the other judges and have more influence than China had when the Philippines argued its case. So China's advancing on multiple fronts. My own recommendation that I made once to our affair is that if they install an ADIZ, then we should violate it every day and with large numbers. Because under international law, and I'll stand corrected if the lawyers here know more, you only have the rights you defend. And whether you defend them with rhetoric to let people know that you object to that, or you do it with a demonstration of military force, is a matter of tactics and other concerns. But we need to orchestrate a united opposition to China seizing that much of Asia's airspace. Because if they take the airspace, then the water underneath is seizable as well. If that makes sense.
No, thank you so much, Captain Schuster, for that answer with a question on ADIZ. Do we have some more questions for our panelists, Captain Alcantara?
At present, everything is covered by my classmates, and I'll just reserve anything if something comes.
All right. Thank you so much. Any question from? I know we have some audience from the media. ABS-CBN, are you in? Or they are on mute? Let's see. All right. Who would like to? A question from the. Did we get some questions from the netizens? Attorney Beth Sena, do you have any question, please? I'm unmuting you. Unmute. All right. There is okay. Any questions? Attorney Beth Sena, you can unmute your video. Okay. All right. Attorney, do you have any question, Attorney Viet, from Attorney Bet Sena from Guam?
I don't have a question.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. How about Dr. Giao from Vietnam? Let's hear our panelists from Vietnam, because very much Vietnam is very much involved now with China, with the recent developments there, the bullying of China over there. So Dr. Giao or Attorney Viet, are you still there? Okay, Attorney Viet, okay. Do you have a question?
Thank you. I have no question.
You don't have any question for Capt. Schuster?
Yeah. I don't have any question for him. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, you're welcome. But this is what I would like to. How about Dr. Giao? Is he there? I don't see him. All right. I think I'll be the one to ask question, right? Captain Schuster, with the recent development in Vietnam, okay, when China, way back, I think this was 2 weeks ago. If I'm right, just correct me if I'm wrong. China had this military exercise at the Paracel Islands with the two ballistic missiles, right? One is a DF-26, which they call as the Guam killer. And I know in 2017, if I'm right, they did have a parade in Beijing showing off this Guam killer that is meant for Guam. That's why they call it Guam killer. So what is the possibility that China would do the same thing like what they did to Vietnam, doing these ballistic missiles?
Having them impact close to the country. They've done missile shots into the Western Pacific. They generally don't come within a couple hundred miles of Guam because they don't know how we'll react. However, they do like us to know they can hit Guam. One of the things the Chinese believe is the United States has never, not since World War II, has taken military action against a country that could reach its own territory. So both North Korea and China hope that by threatening American national territory that they can deter us from intervening in whatever they're planning to do. The downside to that is if they hit U.S. territory, we tend to react in a very passionate and emotional way, and that typically includes military action. And so it becomes a kind of a risk versus reward calculation. It's my belief, and of course we're looking to put Aegis ashore to defend Guam within the next 5 years as a response to that threat. We're also looking at moving more forces to Guam and rotating forces around Guam. So China can never assume they're going to take out a certain level of American forces by hitting Guam. And why hit an empty sack when you know that's going to generate a large reaction? So one of the reasons we're staging aircraft in and around on a near regular basis and moving them around when they come to the Pacific is because of the threat to Guam. We don't want them to be able to anticipate where the planes will be. And we're hoping to establish as many different possibilities for basing and staging so that their targeting situation will be increasingly complex.
All right. Thank you so much for that answer.
Hopefully that answers your question. I tend to walk 5 miles straight.
Right. Yeah. No, because that's very alarming. When I read in the article that China used the DF-26, which they call it as the Guam killer, since we are here in this part of the world, we are in the U.S. territory of Guam, and of course the Northern Mariana Islands. That really alerts me, and it's very alarming for me. So that's why I asked that question. And
yes, ma'am.
And of course that.
And the way to look at it is they developed that missile so that they could drive hostile naval forces out of the first and second island chain. The DF-21 is a first island chain weapon, if you will, and the DF-26 is a second island chain weapon. Both have a model that can be used against large ships, or at least that's what the Chinese advertise. We've seen them do shots against stationary targets. They've only done 2 sets of shots against open ocean targets, but we don't know if they were moving or anchored or just a designated aim spot. They also, if you'll remember, created the 1996 China-Taiwan crisis because they announced a closure area outside of Taiwan to intimidate them just before their presidential elections. And one of the missiles went further than they planned, or at least we believe it did. Anyway, it landed inside Taiwan's territorial waters. Indeed, it landed in the approaches to a major port, and that brought the United States into the dispute. We deployed 2 carriers to demonstrate to the Chinese that an attack on Taiwan was not something we would ignore. We didn't say we would intervene. We didn't say actually what we would do. We simply positioned ourselves there so we had options. The Chinese have not forgotten that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, from the panelists, do you have any question? Again, please.
I have a question for Captain Carl.
Okay.
Edgar Diamante.
Okay, Captain Diamante. All right. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
In your opinion, is the government doing the right thing by avoiding conflict with China?
Open conflict, yes. I said it's not to anyone's advantage to open a conflict, but there are ways to maintain resistance and pressure. For example, one of the things I've talked about with my friends and associates in the academic world is using Coast Guard exercises demonstrates partnership and mutual support, but it doesn't have the military connotation that Navy and Army units have. Coast Guards are perceived as predominantly an environmental protection, regulation enforcement, and law enforcement organization. And so but they become part of the Navy in wartime. So it increases your capability without appearing to be a threat. I think that Vietnam has walked a very careful line in their dealings with China. They are the only ones who fought China directly since the Korean War. And they gave China a pretty good bloody nose, but they realized that a long war would work in China's favor. So they are concentrating on strengthening a partnership with India, establishing and strengthening their relationship with the United States. And I believe they've also approached Japan and the Philippines. So they're looking for as many partners as they can with a mutual interest in deterring China. And I think that's a wise policy. Don't surrender but don't necessarily go in big guns and hope that it'll work out. Always look for the middle ground and a modest solution that lets them know that they're working against their own long-term interest if they continue that behavior.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Captain Schuster and Captain Diamante. Any more questions from our panelists, or do we have some questions from the audience or our netizens at the FB page? Actually, I'm sorry, Captain Schuster. I still have a question.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
All
right. Okay. Since we all know, since April 2012, during the standoff in Scarborough Shoal, okay, we have the Philippine vessels and the Chinese Coast Guards over there. And that's where the Visiting Forces Agreement came in to mediate, right? Now, Chinese Coast Guards and of course the Philippine vessels were told to leave the Scarborough Shoal. But unfortunately, the Chinese Coast Guards did not leave. And until now, they are occupying our Scarborough Shoal. And recently, I read in a foreign article, I'm not going to mention the name of the newspaper, the media, that in Scarborough Shoal, it was already reclaimed and there is already an airstrip. Okay, and this is coming from a very reliable newspaper. Now my question, if China, if there is indeed a truth on the reclamation and the airstrip for landing jets of China, how the United States of America intervene with the Philippines in order for the plan of China to make Scarborough Shoal a military base? You know, how can we stop that? How the U.S. can intervene with that?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, there's no simple answer. It all boils down to political will. It's my belief that if we can mobilize public opinion in the United States and say, look, one advantage the Philippines has over most other countries in Asia is they have a pretty significant expatriate population in the United States. And they're only politically active in Hawaii. It's my belief they should try to be politically active in California, which is a very large and powerful state within the U.S. system. There are ways to pressure China. I'm a big fan of extracting an economic price. China's economy was built on three things: export markets, of which the United States remains the largest, but the other was American companies transferring their manufacturing to China. And some of that expansion was foolish. For example, most of our pharmaceuticals are produced in China. And a large percentage of our medical supplies are produced in China. And I don't know the percentage of medical equipment that's produced in China, but most of it's produced in the United States. But our leaders, and the leaders of every country, I believe, should identify what industries are critical to their national interest, their national survival. Food industry is one of them, medical is another. There's a tendency to only think in terms of weapons production as a national security interest, whereas your national health of your people is critical. Now, that doesn't answer your question directly, but if China has built an airstrip there, and I've got to do some research to confirm it, it's not yet listed on CSIS's website as a military base, but I'll confirm that and get back to you. But if they have, then that violates President Xi's promise to an even greater extent than the other violations of his promises. And I think that that should not go unremarked. And you look at what China's doing in India, what they're doing against Japan, what they're doing against Vietnam, what they've done against Burma, and what they're doing against the Philippines, that should generate a lot of international attention and criticism. And it should affect China's relationships in Africa. In fact, it largely has already. Nigeria is putting constraints on Chinese investment there because they don't like the way the Chinese supervisors treat the local population. They don't like the racism their visitors have faced in China. And more importantly, they think China's beginning to treat them like a colony rather than as a business venue or as a business market. So that gives us a theme that we can apply. Military pressure is a more difficult question and more politically sensitive. Can we blockade Scarborough or introduce some kind of sanction against it? Or blockade's not the right word. I was thinking what we did in Bosnia, where we basically restricted what went into a quarantine. Can we quarantine Scarborough Shoal and so forth? That we will never get UN approval to do that. China will veto it. So in many ways, we're paying the price for bringing China into the UN. So I've walked you 5 miles across the street, but it's not a simple answer. And it's an answer that I think needs to involve a lot of complex activity outside what do we do militarily. I do think we need to visit that area very often with military forces so that they know our eyes are upon them. Maybe just stationing a drone for long-term surveillance over there would send a signal. But it's something to consider.
Okay, thank you so much for that great answer, and
Thank you. You're very
thank you
kind.
so much. Yeah, and I would like to ask other attendees of this forum if you have other questions, because I keep asking questions. I'm taking advantage of this opportunity with Capt. Schuster to ask a lot of questions of what's been happening in the West Philippine Sea and the rest of South China Sea. Any more questions from the audience and from the attendees? Mm-hmm.
If I may make one lesson learned from all this, is China tends to act when no one's looking.
Yes.
So it's
mm-hmm.
important that we maintain surveillance of the areas they occupy, but also the areas they have not yet occupied. My belief is that whenever they find a gap or an absence, that's when they move, and they essentially present you with a fait accompli. If you
Right.
see them coming and you get someone or something there before they can go ashore or before they can establish a naval presence, then escalate the pressure in that area. For example, what if in Scarborough Shoal in 2012, the Philippines had stayed in the United States suddenly started sending ships there and flying carrier aircraft over it? I think that would have forced the Chinese to be much more accommodating to the Philippines' point of view. But that's a personal opinion. I haven't been in government in over a decade, so
All right.
influence is slight.
Right. I do understand, Capt. Schuster. Any more questions from the audience? Because actually, I still have another question. Please feel free to raise your hand if you would like, or say something if you would like to ask questions. This is very interesting because the Philippines, like in the theme, the Philippines is amidst in the rising tension of U.S. and China in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, we call West Philippine Sea the one that's within our EEZ, and for Vietnam, it's the EC, Natuna Sea for the Indonesian. So anyway, if there's any, yes, Sir Pablo, do you have any question to Captain Schuster,
Yes,
please?
I'm just
Okay,
wondering, what's with first, second, and third island chains? What do you think is China's ultimate objective in having these chains? Taking over the islands so that they can form these three chains.
All right. Thank you.
China looks at it from three ways. The initial justification for the first island chain is the Europeans penetrated China and ultimately destroyed the Manchu dynasty by coming in through the sea. And so they look to control the first island chain to prevent that from ever happening again. Since then, the vision has expanded. They wanted the second island chain to control the waters and airspace over the second island chain so that no one with a long-range capability could deter or prevent Chinese actions within the first island chain. For example, if you can keep American forces beyond the first island chain, then you'll have a free hand in the West Philippine Sea and against Taiwan, or indeed against Vietnam or anyone else. And so it's a matter of this provides them an area they can deny, and in denying outsiders, they maintain full freedom of action. They can do what they want. And the third island chain, I think, is a dream. They are pushing that because they're looking for another lever to pressure India. They're also concerned that if they move against India, India may control the Indian Ocean, and 60% of China's energy is imported across the Indian Ocean, even though they're bringing a growing percentage in by pipeline. but their raw materials, even 8% of their coal, has to be delivered from overseas, and most of that passes through the Indian Ocean. Natural gas, same thing. And so when you look at it from an aggressor's perspective, they're looking at it and saying, this is what I want to control and guarantee belongs to me, and this is where I need to be able to project power to maintain my ability to operate however I want within the first two island chains. I think that's what's behind the third island chain.
Okay, thank you so much.
But to be honest, China hasn't made a statement about their goals and intentions in the third island chain, only within the first two.
So it's mostly economic, not military.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much
If
for
you
that.
think about it, if they can dominate the South China Sea and get all of its oil and natural gas resources, then they may not have to bring oil and natural gas in from Africa and the Middle East.
Right. Absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Captain Schuster. Yes. Any more questions from the audience or attendees, panelists? I just wanna, if none, and I still have another question, Captain Schuster, right? Because there's a lot of things happening in our West Philippine Sea, all right? I think this was since 2018. We're in all these Chinese vessels. They call it they are not the PLAs or the People's Liberations Armies of China, but they were called as the civilian fishermen or Chinese fishermen. They were encroaching the Pag-asa Island and even the Sandy Cays near Pag-asa Island. They're like 2 miles away. And as we know, that Subi Reef, which belongs to the Philippines under the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration Order, that belongs to the Philippines, and which is now occupied by China and being militarized. What should the Philippines do with all these tactics of China using paramilitary personnel, like pretending to be fishermen? So they, they're doing some kind of a cabbage strategy in order to occupy island. That's what they did to us. Am I right,
Yes,
Captain
ma'am.
Schuster?
Yeah, in fact, that's how they conquered the Paracel Islands from South Vietnam. They used the People's Maritime Armed Militia to pose as fishermen to set up basically a fish processing camp on one of the islands, Woody Island as we call it. And when the South Vietnamese went in to evict them, China's Navy responded, and the South Vietnamese found themselves outnumbered. And they, of course, their ships had a lot of maintenance problems too, because their priority was on the ground war. And so the Chinese took those islands from South Vietnam. They did the same thing against Vietnam in 1988. You had the People's Armed Maritime Militia fishing in the area. And when the Vietnamese came in to land troops and basically build up what they had on South Johnson Reef, Chinese Navy showed up, and the Vietnamese found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. And so that is a common Chinese tactic. They're doing the same thing off the Japanese claimed islands in the East China Sea. These so-called fishermen show up. They're armed with AK-47s. They've got rocket-propelled grenades, and they have handheld SAMs and small arms. And the fishermen they're bullying are completely unarmed, and they're not military trained. And then the Japanese Coast Guard shows up, and then the Chinese Coast Guard's backing the People's Maritime Militia. Philippines had the same problem. If you think back on Scarborough Shoal, the initial occupation was by People's Armed Maritime Militiamen, and then the Coast Guard showed up. And China's Coast Guard is larger than most of Southeast Asia's fleets, and their ships are individually larger as well. The average Vietnamese Coast Guard vessel is about 300 to 500 tons displacement. Chinese Coast Guard vessels start at about 1,100 tons, and some of them are over 5,000 to 6,000. They are larger than many naval combatants. And so you're at a size disadvantage, you're at a numerical disadvantage, and unfortunately, you don't have the air power to pose a threat they cannot deal with. And so if I were king for a day and had the resources, I would bolster the air threat, and I would make them know that there was an air threat around. If you back off to their People's Armed Maritime Militia, they'll take the ground. Key is how do you shoulder them out of there? Coast Guard can do it, but you need to be ready for their Coast Guard to show up. Japan arrested some of their Chinese fishermen, so did Indonesia. And in both cases, they backed their play by reinforcing their Coast Guard. And so China protested, got angry, but didn't do anything. Didn't take any physical action. And so to an extent, I think some version of that might be useful to the Philippines, but I would bolster your Air Force before I tried it. That's just my personal view. I think air power in constrained waters generally gets most naval officers' attention, particularly if they don't have air cover of their own. Another thing, submarines. If the Philippines had submarines, China could never relax in deep water.
Right. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that answer. Any more questions from the panelists and our guests, attendees? Because I still, I'm sorry, Captain Schuster, I still have a question.
Sure.
Okay. Since 2016, personally, I met the leader of the Scarborough Shoal fishermen in 2016. I will not mention the agencies, but they were told not to say anything bad about China. And they couldn't go to Scarborough Shoal. That's why their livelihood has been affected, of course, including their families, because that they have been fishing there for more than a century. That's their fishing ground. So what do you think should the Philippine government do in terms of partnering with the US government in order to avoid the bullying in Scarborough Shoal or even the rest of the West Philippine Sea, like in Recto Bank or in Ayungin Shoal? Or what do you think? What is a good proposal for the Philippine government as a partnership with the United States? Because I know that the US has a memorandum of agreement with Vietnam in terms of fish and wildlife, and I don't think that the Philippines has the same agreement with the United States. So please kindly give us some kind of suggestions or solutions.
Sure.
Please.
Well, I think that if you haven't got that kind of agreement, I would do it. The other thing I would do is, and I'm becoming something of a broken record, I would seek some kind of bilateral exercise with the American Coast Guard. Let's do a counter-smuggling, a resource regulation, or combat, or search and rescue exercise between the two Coast Guards. The Philippines has unique experiences I think the American Coast Guard would benefit from. And I think the American Coast Guard has unique experiences the Philippines would benefit from. But there's also a political signal in that. It's not as threatening as having two navies work together. But it is significant. It tells them that we're partners and that you mess with one, you're messing potentially with the other. The other thing I would do, or consider, I'm sorry, it's easy for me to say, I'm an American, I'm not the guy that's got to face the music, if you will. But I would also approach the Vietnamese Coast Guard and say, hey, why don't we work together, do a couple of exercises together, maybe just, we used to call them PASEXs, where the two of you patrol in the same area and just practice communicating with each other. That way, neither is surrendering their sovereignty, if you will, and neither is sharing authority over anything. But at the same time, they're learning to work together. It's a politically benign way of working, having your law enforcement, military or paramilitary law enforcement, maritime law enforcement work together. That also sends a signal, but not necessarily a threatening one. But it does add a calculation that China has to take into account. I would also seek an agreement with some of the other claimants on resources. For example, right now they can bully Vietnam because Vietnam was developing oil resources in its claimed areas. And so it was Vietnam versus China. And ultimately, if China decides to be threatening, then China has a superior force at sea. But what if it's a joint consortium with Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam in an area that's close to where all three of them have a claim and they've got some kind of memorandum of agreement for sharing the resources? That sounds easy. I know it sounds easy, but the devil is always in the details. Who's willing to give up 100% to the other players for the certainty of getting something? None of this is risk-free politically. But when you're faced with a bully, even children learn that a group of children can deter a bully. Sometimes that's what you have to do.
I absolutely agree, Captain Schuster, with your solutions and your suggestions.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, can I ask?
Yeah. Excuse me, Captain Schuster. My
Yes,
husband, Mr. Ronald Lampkin, would like to ask a question. There he is.
Sure.
Yeah. No, just put here. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you see him?
No, I don't. But for some reason,
Sir
I see the map
Pablo, Sir
myself,
Pablo,
and that's it.
Mr. Lampkin.
Oh, there we go. I see you, and I see a man sitting next to you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Okay, good enough. Actually, this topic hasn't come up unless you mentioned it before. Okay, we're having a global pandemic.
Yes, sir.
And, I've noticed through my readings that a lot of countries around the world are looking at China in a different way. In other words, I think you mentioned before, hit them in the pocketbook, okay? In other words, money counts to those people. And I'm just wondering whether that, or what your thoughts might be on how this global pandemic may affect how, I don't know, how the globe, other countries start reacting to China. Because it seems like some of them are starting to push back. Some of them don't seem to want money anymore from them. I think you mentioned some places in Africa. Anyway, maybe just your thoughts on how the global pandemic might actually slow down their aggression.
Yes, sir. It has hurt their reputation. One thing we can say for sure is China hid the seriousness of the outbreak for over 7 weeks. And the impact that had is there are over 50,000 Chinese workers from Wuhan who work in India, work in Italy, northern Italy. And China didn't tell Italy or the world about the outbreak in Wuhan. So when those workers returned to Italy right after Christmas, suddenly within 3 weeks, Italy has a massive outbreak. And of course, from the outbreak in Europe, it made its way into New York, which is the entry point for most visitors from Europe and the Mediterranean into the United States. And so China's secrecy and hiding of the seriousness of the outbreak has severely damaged its reputation. The other problem was China made a big gesture of providing medical equipment and masks. And what they found was the majority of the equipment was not serviceable. and the majority of the mask and testing that was provided was defective. And that often happens when you're in a hurry and you don't do quality control. But China has a history of poor quality control anyway. And so all of that has hurt China's reputation. And it has triggered boycotts and back push, if you will, in many parts of Europe, Italy among them. The Czech Republic, in fact, just had their Senate speaker visit Taiwan. China's treatment of the Uyghurs, the 1 million Uyghurs sitting in concentration camps, has also triggered condemnation in Europe. The political elites and the business elites are still reluctant to act, though. They've got a lot of money invested in China, and a lot of them get a significant percentage of their income from China, from business in China. So it's going to be, excuse me, it's going to move in fits and starts. But I do think the trend is China is going to have trouble opening new markets, and some of its current markets are going to shrink. The other thing affecting China is their workers no longer accept substandard working conditions. They no longer accept stable wages at a time of inflation. So they're starting to do work stoppages and things to get better working conditions, better pay. The environmental shortcuts China's taken for the last 20 years have begun to damage the water quality and air quality, so they're having to take that into account. That raises production costs, raises investment costs. Meanwhile, the same light industries that China used to build its export markets are now springing up in other countries. And the problems that China has had or presented in terms of intellectual property theft, they've been promising for 45 years that they would solve that problem, and they've never acted to do it. And everyone's just kind of said, well, they'll do it next year, next year, next year. Well, the COVID-19 outbreak has opened people's eyes to the fact that next year ain't coming. And so businesses are struggling with, how do I pull out? Because under Chinese law, once you move your equipment into China, you cannot take it out of China without the Chinese government's permission. So it's a one-way road. And so disengaging from China is very expensive. And that's why you're going to see kind of a fits and starts approach. The good news is technology advances quickly. So what works today in China, maybe you can set up a new plant for the new technology and new production in the Philippines. Just a thought. I'm not a businessman, and I certainly don't know computers.
Okay, well, thank you, Captain, for your insight into that. No, I always keep thinking economics. That is what's going to slow them down. You know, economics. I mean, if you can hit them in the pocketbook, somehow push back on that, you're going to, in fact, that's how they got to where they are in the first place, correct?
Yes, sir. The other thing, too, is the Communist Party's been promising the Chinese people higher quality of life since they took over the country. And one of the reasons Deng Xiaoping initiated the economic reforms is because the population was tired of being told, well, one more sacrifice, we'll get it next. Deng Xiaoping recognized that if they continued Mao's policies, there'd be no Communist Party in China. And so they're in the dilemma that all governments are in, but for them, it's particularly poignant. If they don't keep the economy growing, the party's legitimacy as the political authority over the country comes into question. Xi is already getting criticism for the way he handled the COVID-19 virus. He's also getting criticism for the basic outflow of capital from Hong Kong and the bad publicity. China's arresting dissidents trying to escape Hong Kong. They got 10 trying to escape by sea just last week. An exodus of brain power is coming. And,
I read that.
And so hitting them in the pocketbook is a double whammy. You're not only hurting them in terms of denying resources to take aggressive action, but you're also attacking their political legitimacy. They have to do something.
Well, thanks, Captain. Yeah, I really appreciate what you have to say there. That makes sense to me, and those are my thoughts exactly. Thank you very
sir.
much. Thank you very
you.
much.
Thank you, Mr. Lampkin, for your question, and thank you so much, Captain Schuster, for the response and the insights. I would like to ask from the panelists, any more questions? And the audience, our attendees, guests. Captain Schuster, I'm not hearing anybody asking question. I hope you don't mind. I still have another question.
Sure.
Did I hear somebody would like to ask a question? None? Okay. I know that this is my question, Captain Schuster. I know China from the very beginning, you know, way back, they've been on how they built these artificial islands. They have devastated, destroyed our ecosystems. And you know, the ecosystems in the West Philippine Sea is one of the largest ecosystems in the world. So basically, it doesn't only affect the Philippines, but the whole world. So, and of course, our corals that it would take 100 years or more than 200 years to recover, or
Yes, ma'am.
and also the dredging of sand. And we have seen the mountains in Zambales, they are already flattened. All right. I have seen some equipments, of course, that was forwarded to me, the dredger of China. And as a result of all these reclamation activities of China and the artificial island building and the militarization or building military bases, like for example, in the Subi Reef and of course our Mischief Reef that is already militarized, they have destroyed a lot of marine resources.
Yes, ma'am.
So how would the Philippines, is it possible for the Philippines to charge China for all the damages that it has done to our territories, to our seas, our marine resources, to our ecosystems, in all these reclamation activities and military bases that they have built? Like for example, the Philippines has a lot of debts to China, you know, with all those build program of the Philippine government. I'm kind of like thinking, why are we going to pay China? And in the first place, you know, China owes us trillions and trillions of dollars for what they have done to our territories, right? Whether it's marine, the islands, building islands. So what do you think the Philippine government should do, or what should the ordinary Filipinos should do?
That's a tough one, because China has stated openly that they will not accept any lawsuit or judgment against them for environmental damage. Plus, the international environmental groups like World Wildlife Federation and Greenpeace, they're not interested in accusing China. They get too much money from Chinese foundations. They just don't see it as worthwhile to criticize China. It'll cost them income. They'll sue the Philippine government because your government obeys the law, and they get a ruling in the Philippines against the government will be forced to comply. Same thing when they sue the United States. A U.S. minesweeper ran aground in a reef. Greenpeace sued us for like $20 million in a U.S. court. Meanwhile, China has destroyed 147 square kilometers of reef and sensitive marine environment in the West Philippine Sea, and that destruction has affected another 3.4 million square kilometers. And so, but there's no lawsuit, no criticism from Greenpeace, not even a sentence decrying
Yes.
China's actions in the World Wildlife Federation.
Mhm.
And the reason is there's no money in it for them and there's no political advantage. There's no Chinese politician looking for them to make an environmental statement while he or she runs for re-election. Whereas in your country and mine, that gives them leverage. And so to quote Noam Chomsky, who was once asked why he didn't criticize the Soviet Union, he said, because it had had no impact and there's nothing in it for me. That is exactly the international environmental group's attitude towards China in the West Philippine Sea. And unless we're able to change that formula, it's never going to change. Canceling the debt to China is politically and economically risky. And the reason is, if China treats it as a default, then that affects the Philippines and its companies' ability to purchase things by credit. And most international commerce is based on a flow of credit or a guarantee of credit. Overnight cash flows, that sort of thing. It's all based on a very limited and constrained type of loan. If you default or someone argues you've defaulted on a loan, then that financial flow disappears for your country. And so for the Philippines, the difficult decision then is, have we reached a point in our relationship with China where we risk more damage if we let it continue than we would if we act? Why not take China to court in a Philippine court, and then the Philippine court awards the debt to the Philippine suitor? Okay, then you take the debt, it's now yours. China knows then they're not going to get the money, and they've just paid a price indirectly. Now, the hard part is can the Philippines repay? Philippines didn't do the damage, so how does the Philippine government handle it? And the answer to that is beyond my knowledge. But politically, it's risky. And you need, everything of that nature has a cost versus risk versus reward calculation. And so you need to weigh that carefully before you take any action. There are a lot of innovative actions you can take, but they all carry a political risk.
Thank you so much for that, Captain Schuster. As a follow-up on that one, how, for example, with the question I asked earlier, how would the United States of America can assist the Philippine government in pursuing for China to pay the damages? Are there any ways the U.S. government can help the Philippines?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, there are a lot of actions that people talk about periodically. For example, during some kinds of conflicts and crisis, you can nationalize somebody's investment in your country. The trouble is we've invested more in China than they have in the United States. And so that becomes, basically remove your entire face to spite your nose. However, I'm one who believes that if we had signed a trade agreement with the Philippines to where we replace China as the Philippines' primary market, and by the way, a relationship we used to have, then and channel our investment into the Philippines, then that would inflict a price on China. It may not be apparent right away, but in 5 or 10 years, it would have an impact. And China would know that. And so Xi would take the hit within the Communist Party, if you will, for having done the actions that led to that development. I'm one who thinks our failure to sign the Theater Trade Pact was a mistake. The Philippines is one of our, in fact, is our longest standing ally in Southeast Asia. So why not, and plus most of us, none of us speak Tagalog. I'm as ignorant as the next American. But a high percentage of the Philippines speaks English. And so doing business with the Philippines and in the Philippines is easier than in most other countries.
Correct.
And although some of our history is negative, most of it's quite positive. We fought beside each other in 3 wars. Now, one of those wars wasn't of the Philippines choosing, but at the same time, commitments bonded in blood tend to be infinite. And trade is something we had the opportunity to expand with the Philippines, and for reasons domestic political reasons here, we chose not to do it. I personally think that was a mistake. I think that worried about jobs moving to the Philippines is far less serious a matter than allowing the mass export of those jobs to China. We move those jobs and production capacity to a country whose future intentions towards us were at best unknown. Had we invested that in the Philippines, a country who generally thinks of us in positive terms and certainly reacts to us in positive terms, keep in mind that Duterte may be an exception, but he's an exception based on his own personal experiences with the United States. So, and for all of his negativity, overall, he has had a bumpy maybe, but predominantly positive relationship with the United States. In many ways, he's kind of like a Tagalog-speaking Trump.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so
Very
much
similar
for
in
that.
age, too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that response, Captain Schuster. I think, I'm not sure this would be my, I would like to ask the rest, if you still have questions, please feel free to ask questions. It seems that I'm the only one asking questions now, but you know, please feel free to ask questions. Any more from the panelists? Any more questions? Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, I answered their questions satisfactorily. Oh, sorry.
There is a question. Is someone asking question, please?
Captain Tagal.
Okay, Captain Tagal. All right. Okay. Captain Tagal, you have a, please go ahead, please. Mm-hmm.